Keyframe 1. The hook. The chainsaw hit the third oak at exactly 8:42 a.m., and by the time Mark Ellis ran barefoot onto his own front lawn, $18,600 worth of mature trees were already on the ground. The smell of fresh-cut wood hung heavy in the humid suburban air, sharp and raw, like something that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. Sawdust coated the driveway where his kids used to draw with chalk. A man in a neon vest raised his hand like he was stopping traffic. "Sir, you need to step back. This is authorized removal." "Authorized by who?" Mark demanded, his voice cracking as he looked at the stump. "Clean, deliberate, final." Behind the workers, a black SUV idled quietly. Inside sat two members of the HOA board watching. One of them didn't even get out. And that's when Mark noticed something else, something that didn't make sense. Because those trees weren't just his. At least, not entirely. And someone on that board should have known that. Keyframe 2. The setup expanded to 600 words. Mark Ellis had lived in the neighborhood for 12 years, long enough to remember when the entrance gate still groaned every morning at exactly 7 o'clock a.m. whenever residents left for work. Back then, the subdivision had felt quieter, less polished. The sidewalks cracked in places. Kids rode bicycles through the cul-de-sac until sunset without anyone complaining to the HOA about unauthorized recreational activity. Now everything felt monitored. The old gate had been replaced with silent electric motors and high-definition security cameras mounted above stone columns at the entrance. New board members enforced regulations nobody remembered voting on. Trash cans left visible for more than 12 hours earned warning letters. Basketball hoops disappeared from driveways almost overnight. But through all those changes, the trees behind Mark's house had stayed the same. 4 enormous white oaks towered along the edge of his backyard, their thick branches stretching wide enough to cast shade across nearly half the property by late afternoon. In the summer, the temperature beneath them felt 10 degrees cooler. In autumn, their leaves drifted down in golden waves that covered the grass so deeply his kids used to dive into them laughing while his wife recorded videos from the patio. The trees had become part of the house itself, part of the life built there. Mark still remembered the first evening they moved in. Exhausted from unpacking boxes, he'd walked into the backyard carrying a folding chair and a warm beer from the cooler. The sun had been dropping behind the trees, pouring orange light through the branches while cicadas buzzed softly in the distance. "This is why we bought this place," his wife had said quietly beside him. She was right. The oaks formed a natural wall between his property and a narrow strip of HOA-maintained green space running behind several homes. Technically, it belonged to the association, but nobody really used it except landscapers every Thursday morning. The kids in the neighborhood treated it like a tiny forest path. Over the years, Mark barely thought about property lines at all, until one HOA meeting changed everything. It had happened nearly a decade earlier during a dull discussion about drainage issues near the back lots. Someone briefly mentioned the trees while flipping through maintenance documents. "What about those oaks near the Ellis property?" a resident had asked casually. An older board member barely looked up from his paperwork. "Shared boundary trees," he'd said with a shrug. "They're fine where they are." That was it. No concern, no dispute, no warning. The conversation moved on within seconds. And for years afterward, nobody mentioned the trees again. Not once. Until the letter arrived. It came on a humid Tuesday afternoon just after Mark returned home from work. The envelope sat wedged halfway inside the mailbox, thick and stiff with bright green certified mail stickers plastered across the front. Mark frowned immediately. Nobody sends certified mail unless they want proof you received bad news. He tore it open while walking back up the driveway. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA Compliance Committee printed on expensive white paper with the community logo stamped across the top. The wording felt cold and overly polished, like it had been reviewed by attorneys before mailing. Notice of vegetation violation. Mark stopped walking. He read the first paragraph once, then again slower. The notice cited excessive vegetation encroachment, potential root system interference, and elevated liability exposure involving community property. According to the letter, corrective action would be required within 10 business days to prevent further risk to association infrastructure. Mark looked toward the backyard instinctively. The trees swayed gently in the warm afternoon breeze. Healthy, massive, completely unchanged from the day he moved in. What liability? He muttered under his breath. He kept reading. The HOA claimed multiple complaints had been filed regarding overhanging limbs and unsafe proximity to the adjacent green space. Failure to comply, the letter warned, could result in association authorized mitigation measures at the homeowner's expense. Mitigation measures. The phrase sounded intentionally vague. Mark felt irritation rising in his chest. Not fear. Yet, just confusion. Because none of it matched reality. The trees weren't dying. They weren't damaged. No branches had fallen. No sidewalks were cracked. Even the landscaping crews worked around them every week without issue. He flipped through the remaining pages looking for photographs, inspection reports, anything explaining why this was suddenly happening after 12 years. There was nothing. Just legal wording, deadlines, and implied consequences. A breeze rustled through the oak canopy overhead as Mark stood motionless in the driveway, staring down at the papers. Then his eyes caught one final sentence near the bottom of the page. Failure to cooperate may result in immediate corrective action authorized by the board. Mark read that line twice, slowly, and for the first time since opening the envelope. Something about the situation stopped feeling routine. Because the letter didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a decision already made. Keyframe 3 Co B is high expand acra key do 550 words main keyframe 3 the HOA action expanded to 55 words 3 days later. The trucks arrived without warning. Mark never heard a doorbell. No knock. No phone call. No final notice taped to the door. Just a low rumble of diesel engines rolling slowly into the cul-de-sac at 8:11 on a Thursday morning. At first, he thought the landscaping crew had come early. Then he heard the chainsaws. The sound tore through the quiet neighborhood with violent urgency, metal screaming against wood, followed by the heavy crack of splitting branches. Mark looked up from his kitchen table so fast his coffee tipped sideways across a stack of unopened mail. Outside, 2 utility trucks were already parked along the curb beside his property. Workers in neon safety vests moved quickly across the lawn carrying ropes, saws, and fuel cans like they were operating on a strict schedule. One man wrapped orange tape around the trunk of the nearest oak while another revved a chainsaw near the base. For a second, Mark genuinely thought there had been some kind of mistake. He shoved open the front door and hurried outside. "Hey!" he shouted, jogging barefoot down the driveway. "What's going on?" Nobody answered immediately. The chainsaw roared louder. Then the first branch fell. It crashed through the canopy with an explosion of leaves before slamming into the grass hard enough to shake the ground beneath Mark's feet. Smaller limbs snapped after it like gunfire. "Stop!" Mark yelled. "You can't do this!" A stocky man carrying a clipboard stepped directly into his path. "Sir, you need to stay clear of the work zone." "What work zone?" Mark snapped. "Those are my trees." The foreman flipped a page on the clipboard with practiced indifference. "Removal order approved by the HOA board," he said flatly. Section 4.3. Hazard mitigation and community safety compliance. Mark stared at him in disbelief. "Hazard mitigation?" he repeated. "These trees are perfectly healthy." The foreman shrugged without emotion. "Not my call, man. We just do the work." Behind them, another worker drove a wedge into the trunk while the chainsaw bit deeper into the wood. The ancient oak groaned under the pressure, the sound strangely human as the cut widened inch by inch. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears. "This is insane," he said. "You people can't just walk onto someone's property and start cutting things down." That's when he noticed the SUV, parked quietly across the street beneath the morning shade, sat a black luxury SUV with tinted windows and the engine still running. Mark recognized it instantly. HOA board member Linda Carver. Even from a distance, the vehicle carried that same polished, untouchable energy she brought into every neighborhood meeting. As if on cue, the rear passenger window rolled down halfway. Linda leaned slightly toward the opening, sunglasses covering most of her face. "Mr. Ellis," she called calmly. Multiple notices were issued regarding liability concerns. Mark took a step toward the vehicle. "Liability to who?" he demanded. Linda adjusted the papers resting in her lap. "The root systems were interfering with association-maintained property. The board voted unanimously. You voted to destroy my yard? Her expression never changed. We voted to address a safety issue. Then the window rolled back up. Just like that. Dismissed. Mark stood frozen for a moment while the chainsaws continued screaming behind him. Another massive limb crashed down, scattering leaves across the driveway where his daughter used to ride her scooter after school. By noon, 2 trees were completely gone. All that remained were raw stumps surrounded by shredded bark and piles of sawdust baking beneath the afternoon sun. At 1:15, workers began cutting into the third tree, the largest oak of them all. That was when Mark noticed something strange near the base of the remaining trunk. Half buried beneath loose dirt and wood debris sat a small metal survey marker. Old, weathered, crooked. He frowned immediately, because the marker wasn't where he remembered it being. Not even close. And suddenly, through all the noise and destruction, one thought cut through the chaos with perfect clarity. What if the Hoa had removed trees that weren't entirely theirs to touch? Keyframe 4 Kobe's expand Ekra key do 500 words a Minka frame 4 The escalation expanded to 50 words the next morning. Mark found the notice taped directly to his front door. Not mailed, not certified. Keyframe 2 The setup expanded to 450 words. Mark Ellis had lived in the neighborhood for 12 years. 12 years of early mornings, quiet evenings, and the predictable rhythm of suburban life where nothing usually changed unless the Hoa decided it should. He still remembered the first week he moved in. The entrance gate used to groan loudly every morning at 7 o'clock a.m., a metal complaint echoing across the subdivision as commuters left for work. The streets were simpler back then, fewer rules posted on signs, fewer reminders about what homeowners could and couldn't do with their own property. Over time, the neighborhood changed. The gate was replaced with a smooth automatic system that opened silently, paired with security cameras mounted high above stone pillars. Landscaping became stricter, more uniform. Even the grass seemed regulated, trimmed into identical patterns that made every yard look like it belonged to the same carefully controlled design. But behind Mark's house, one thing never changed. The 4 white oak trees. They stood at the rear edge of his backyard, tall and deeply rooted, forming a natural boundary between his property and a narrow strip of Hoa-maintained green space. Beyond, their branches stretched outward like a living roof, casting wide shade across the lawn during hot summer afternoons. His kids grew up under those trees. They played there, ran beneath them, and in autumn they buried themselves in piles of fallen leaves that turned the backyard into something almost magical. His wife used to call that space the best part of the house, and for years, it was just that simple. No disputes, no complaints, no warnings. The trees had always been there long before Mark bought the property, and when he asked about them early on, he was told they were part of a shared boundary arrangement. Shared boundary trees, someone had said during an Hoa meeting. Flipping casually through paperwork. They're fine as they are. No one raised concerns. No one suggested removal. So the topic disappeared. Years passed without a single mention, until the letter arrived. It came on a humid afternoon, heavy and formal, stamped with certified mail labels that immediately made Mark uneasy. He opened it standing in the kitchen, still holding his car keys. Inside was a notice of vegetation violation. At first, he thought it must be a mistake. The wording didn't match what he knew about his property. It referenced overgrowth, encroachment, liability exposure, and mandatory corrective action. Mark walked to the back door without finishing the letter. The trees stood perfectly still in the afternoon light. Healthy, strong, unchanged. That was the moment something felt off. Because for 12 years, those trees had been part of the neighborhood background, ignored, accepted, unquestioned. And now, suddenly, they had become a problem that required immediate action. Keyframe 4 The escalation expanded to 50 words the next morning didn't feel normal from the moment Mark opened his front door. A bright orange notice was taped directly to the wood, its color almost aggressive against the neutral tones of the house. It wasn't placed neatly in an envelope or slipped into the mailbox like official correspondence usually was. It was displayed, intentional, visible. Mark peeled it off slowly, already sensing he wasn't going to like what it said. The heading was bold and stamped in all caps, immediate reimbursement required. His eyes dropped to the amount, $7,500. He paused, read it again, and then let out a short, disbelieving breath. According to the HOA notice, Mark was now responsible for covering the cost of emergency vegetation mitigation services that had been performed on his property. The document cited hazard removal operations, equipment deployment, and labor expenses associated with the cutting of the trees. Payment was due within 14 days. Failure to comply, the notice warned, could result in additional enforcement action, including potential liens placed against the property. Mark stood there for a moment holding the paper loosely in one hand. Then he laughed. Not a joyful laugh. A sharp, tired, almost disbelieving sound that echoed faintly across the quiet porch. "They cut down my trees," he muttered, shaking his head. "And now I'm paying for it." He looked out toward the backyard. The change was immediate and unsettling. Without the oaks, the yard felt exposed in a way he couldn't ignore. Sunlight poured directly across the grass without interruption, making everything look harsher, flatter, more open than it had ever been before. The familiar shade that once stretched across half the lawn was gone. In its place were raw stumps, fresh, cleanly cut, still surrounded by scattered sawdust and tire impressions left by heavy equipment. Across the street, a neighbor stood by his mailbox pretending to check mail that clearly wasn't there. He glanced up at Mark, then quickly looked away, then back again like he wasn't sure if he should say something or pretend nothing happened. Finally, he walked closer. "They really did it, huh?" the neighbor asked quietly. Mark held up the orange notice. "And now they want me to pay for it." The neighbor's eyebrows rose slightly as he read the amount. $7,500? He repeated. "For trees they cut on your property?" Mark nodded once. The neighbor exhaled slowly through his nose. "That's bold." But Mark wasn't really focused on the money anymore. The number was frustrating, but it wasn't the real problem. What bothered him was the certainty behind it. There was no hesitation in the notice, no suggestion of review, no acknowledgement that there might be a dispute. The HOA wasn't asking questions. They were issuing demands, like the outcome had already been decided. Mark looked again at the stumps, then toward the quiet SUV parked further down the street earlier that morning in his memory. The same calm, confidence from the day before still lingered in his mind. That's what unsettled him most. Not the damage, not even the cost, but the fact that whoever made these decisions seemed completely convinced they had the right to do it. And people who are that certain usually believe they're protected by something. Keyframe 5. The discovery expanded to 450 words that afternoon. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation didn't add up. The HOA's confidence, the sudden enforcement, the way everything escalated without discussion. None of it matched how things had worked in the neighborhood for the past 12 years. So he did the one thing most people forget to do until it's too late. He went looking for the original paperwork. Inside the hallway closet, behind stacked storage boxes and old holiday decorations, was a thick folder labeled property documents. It hadn't been opened in years. Dust clung to the edges when he pulled it out and set it on the dining table. For a moment, he just stared at it. Then he opened it. Inside were closing papers from when he bought the house. Mortgage documents, inspection reports, utility setup forms. Everything neatly stacked from a time when ownership still felt new and uncertain. Mark flipped through page after page until he found what he was looking for. The survey. It was folded carefully, slightly yellowed at the edges but still intact. When he unfolded it across the table, it nearly covered the entire surface. Lines, measurements, property boundaries drawn with precise accuracy. At first, it looked complicated, but then he saw the rear boundary, and everything stopped. The line wasn't where he expected it to be. He leaned closer, eyes scanning slowly across the diagram. The 4 oak trees were marked near the back of the property. Small circles on the map, positioned along the boundary line between his land and the HOA green space. Mark traced the line with his finger. Once, then again, more slowly this time, and realization began to settle in. 2 of the trees were entirely inside his property boundary. No overlap, no shared zone, fully within his ownership. The 3rd tree sat directly on the boundary line itself, meaning it was jointly owned, legally requiring consent from both sides before any removal. And the fourth tree, Mark paused. That one was fully outside the HOA's jurisdiction marker, completely on his property according to the original survey. He leaned back in his chair, the paper still spread out in front of him. For a moment, the room felt quieter than usual, because this changed everything. The HOA hadn't just removed trees from a shared space or disputed zone. According to the original legal documents, they had authorized removal of property that was clearly and fully owned by him. Mark stared at the survey again, making sure he hadn't misread it. But the lines didn't move. The measurements didn't change. The truth was fixed in ink and certification stamps. He picked up his phone and took photos of every page, carefully documenting each section of the boundary map. Then he sat back, eyes still locked on the diagram. The situation no longer felt like a misunderstanding. It felt like something much more serious. Because if this survey was correct, then the HOA hadn't just made a bad decision. They had crossed a legal boundary they were never supposed to cross in the first place. Keyframe 6. The tension expanded to 4 whole words. Mark didn't waste time after the discovery. The next morning, before the neighborhood fully woke up, he was already on the phone. "I need a license boundary verification survey," he said, pacing slowly in the kitchen while the coffee machine hummed in the background. "Not a general inspection, actual property line confirmation." The voice on the other end asked a few routine questions, but something about his tone must have made it clear this wasn't casual. "I can send a team out within 48 hours, they said." "That's fine," Mark replied. "The sooner the better." By the time Friday arrived, 2 surveyors pulled up in a wide truck carrying tripods, measuring tools, and electronic equipment. It looked more serious than anything the HOA had used during the tree removal. They stepped onto Mark's property, calmly, setting up instruments near the back lawn where the stumps still sat like fresh wounds in the ground. Mark stood nearby, arms crossed, holding the original survey documents. Across the street, movement began almost immediately. Neighbors noticed. Windows shifted. Garage doors opened slightly and closed again. People were watching now. Midway through the setup, a silver SUV pulled up sharply along the curb. Linda Carver stepped out. She didn't look happy. Her heels clicked quickly against the pavement as she crossed toward the yard. "What exactly is happening here?" she asked, stopping near the survey equipment. One of the technicians barely looked up. "Boundary verification." Linda turned toward Mark instead. "We already resolved the property lines," she said firmly. The board acted based on established HOA maps. Mark held up the folder in his hand. "These," he said, "or the actual certified survey?" Her eyes flicked briefly toward the documents, but she didn't take them. "Those are outdated," she replied quickly. The surveyor finally straightened up. "Property lines don't expire," he said simply, adjusting his equipment. A brief silence followed. Not dramatic, just uncomfortable. Linda exhaled slowly and forced a thin smile. "We'll review your findings," she said, stepping back toward her vehicle. Mark nodded once. "You should." As she left, the surveyors began marking the ground with bright flags and precise measurements. Each marker placed along the boundary line felt more final than the last. And as Mark watched them work, one thought kept repeating in his mind. If the lines were confirmed exactly where he believed they were, then everything the HOA had done so far wasn't just a mistake. It was a violation. And now there would be proof. Keyframe 7. The twist expanded to 4 whole words. The updated survey arrived the next morning. No delay, no ambiguity, just a thick sealed envelope delivered with the kind of formality that immediately signals finality. Mark picked it up from the porch before anyone else in the neighborhood was awake. Inside was the certified boundary report. Stamped, signed, legally validated. He spread it across the dining table, already knowing this document would decide the direction of everything that followed. The first pages confirmed what the field surveyors had measured the day before. Property lines drawn with exact coordinates. Reference points matched to official municipal records. Everything aligned with legal registry data, not just old subdivision assumptions. Mark's eyes moved straight to the section that mattered most. The trees. He read slowly. Once, then again. The confirmation was undeniable. 2 of the trees that had been cut down stood entirely within his property boundary. No overlap, no shared designation. They were fully legally his. The third tree, the largest one, sat directly on the boundary line. The report clearly labeled it as a boundary tree, meaning joint ownership. Under standard property law, neither party could remove or alter it without mutual written consent. Mark's jaw tightened slightly as he processed that part, because he had never given any consent. Not verbally, not in writing, not through any HOA communication. Then he reached the final line, the fourth tree, still standing, still untouched. According to the survey, it was entirely within his property limits, not adjacent, not shared, fully under his ownership with no HOA jurisdiction attached to it at all. Mark leaned back in his chair slowly. For a moment, he didn't move. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Everything suddenly felt different, because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It wasn't a gray area or a disagreement between neighbors. It was precise, documented, measurable. The HOA hadn't just removed trees they believed were theirs. They had acted on incorrect boundary assumptions and carried out irreversible damage based on those assumptions. Mark reached for his phone and began taking photos of every page, carefully capturing the stamps, signatures, and highlighted sections. Each image felt more important than the last. Then he sent the file to an attorney he had already contacted the day before. Within minutes, a response came back. Do not engage with HOA directly. Preserve all documentation. Mark stared at the message for a moment, then looked back at the survey spread across the table. The situation had shifted completely now. What started as a landscaping dispute had turned into something much more serious. Because once a certified boundary report confirms ownership, anything done outside those lines stops being a policy issue and starts becoming liability.